Is immigration out of control? Energy costs fall, but bills stay high. And our government WhatsApp messages fair game. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, Shadow Policing Minister Sarah Jones, Head of the Good Law Project Jo Coburn, and writer and broadcaster Timandra Harkness. Today, migration hits a record high. The Prime Minister responds.
Numbers are too high. It's as simple as that, and I want to bring them down.
We need a system that works, but it has to be properly controlled and managed, rather than the chaos that the government has created.
Yeah.
What does record migration mean for you, the economy, Brexit, and for the government, which keeps promising to cut it? Should this man's WhatsApp messages and diaries be handed over to the COVID inquiry? And
my worst fears are that we, the field, the technology, the industry, cause significant harm to the world.
Has this man changed Rishi Sunak's mind on AI? And the energy price cap falls, but will you notice it?
This will feel still expensive for many customers. Roughly £2,000 a year is still well above the price that people paid in 2021.
Well, let's start with that story. You heard the head of Ofgem there just at the end of the headlines. The energy price cap will be set now at an annual level of £2,074. The lower cap is going to replace the government's energy price guarantee, which currently limits the typical household energy bill to around £2,500, meaning the typical annual bill will fall by, again, around £426. But, as you heard there, energy bills will still remain high, far higher than they were a few years ago before the war in Ukraine. My question to the panel to start the programme, though, Tom, with you, is it the government's job to continue to support people with their bills?
Well, I'm pleased the government stepped in and has paid around half of many people's energy bills. I think that was necessary, and I think it was the right thing to do. It's a very big intervention, and it's an intervention with consequences for public finances.
But I think it was the right thing to do.
No, I think the government should continue to support people for as long as they need it. I think that the news today is positive, but clearly we've got a long way to go before we get energy prices down. And it's also important when we talk about energy prices, we're not just thinking about households, but also
they're falling.
Businesses as well. Because I often talk to businesses who are raising it perhaps more with me now than anybody else, and that's also a concern. So it's some good news, but a long way to go.
Right, but you said, actually, there should be more help. So do you think the government should continue with helping people pay their bills in the way they have done?
I think the government should continue to help people for as long as it needs to. And I think when you have dramatic increases in the cost of energy bills like we've seen, it was appropriate that the government intervened. But we are beginning to see prices stabilise, and hopefully, over time, they'll go back to where they were before this crisis. And the sooner that happens, the better for the households, the better for businesses, and also the better for the exchequer.
Would you be in favour of more government intervention directly? It sounds like Tom is in favour of that until bills get down. I mean, they've got a fair way to go down to the sort of levels of 2020.
Yeah, I mean, it's good news today, of course it is, but those bills are still eye-wateringly high. I think about 80% higher than they were before the crisis hit.
Would you favour government?
What we want, unashamedly, is long-term policies to stop this sticking plaster approach that we've seen from government. So a direct intervention to help people would be to insulate homes. Now, we called for this mass insulation of our housing stock 18 months ago. The government could have done 3 million homes by now, and that would reduce bills by £1,000.
But is this the point at which the government is this the point at which a government, a Labour government perhaps next year, says we've done as much as we can and we're going to stop intervening and actually paying part of people's energy bills, and prices are just going to be higher for a bit?
Well, we said from the start that there should be a proper windfall tax on the energy companies, and we would have created more money from that. But things like insulating our homes, creating jobs through clean energy, which would bring our energy prices down, are unashamedly policies that over the long term and the short term will actually bring those prices down, and that's got to be how we fix our energy prices.
They are long term. But what I'm trying to get to is how much can people expect government to do on their behalf? There was the furlough scheme, and we've had, rightly or wrongly, both the politicians say, an intervention in terms of the soaring energy prices. When do you think the right time is for the government to withdraw that help?
Well, it's not yet, because we can see what's happening. People are really, really struggling to pay the bills. The Resolution Foundation earlier this month released figures showing that 37% of families with 3 or more children skipped a meal last month. Really, really, really worrying figures in a mature economy. What I'd like to see, I think what most of the sector actually would like to see, is a social tariff. So you supply to families energy at a low price, up to a particular consumption level, and if people want to heat their private swimming pools, as Rishi Sunak does, they can pay for that at open market prices. We also need, of course, continued investment in renewables, because that's the way in which you deliver long-term price falls.
What do you think about the level of government intervention and when it stops?
Well, I mean, I think it was a good thing they did it, because otherwise a number of people would have frozen to death. This is the bottom line.
Yeah. But people may still be really in hardship.
They've still gone up astonishingly much, to the extent that I'm starting to think, is this part of a long-term plan? It's like we can't increase energy supply, so let's force people to reduce demand by just not being able to afford it. But I think it's a supply-side problem, and I think successive governments have just failed to take any responsibility for the fact that a growing economy and a growing country needs growing amounts of energy. I mean, look, there's that terrible quote from Nick Clegg 20 years ago saying, well, there's no point in building nuclear because it won't be online for 20 years. And here we are. And if we had nuclear, we would at least have plentiful electricity. We wouldn't necessarily have to burn gas to get electricity, and we could keep the gas for heating. But, insulation, great, fine. I mean, there are a lot of practical barriers to it. In fact, it's not as easy as you just send some people in to insulate.
Well, no, clearly,
but it doesn't help industries. I mean, why have we not got a healthy, profitable steel industry in this country? Because our energy is too expensive relative to other countries.
All right,
that's the bottom line.
We're going to leave it there and move on to immigration, because those net migration figures have come out earlier this morning. They are at a record high. Net migration is the difference between the number of people who immigrate into the UK and the number of people who emigrate, who leave the UK. And that net figure for last year is 606,000. Let's welcome 2 guests. Angus West, Director of Garth West, a packaging company in Hull. Hello to you. And also to Faye Hall, Director of an event recruitment company in Hitchin in Hertfordshire. First of all, just your response, Angus, to the figures. 606,000 net migration for 2022.
Well, Jo, it's a huge number, obviously. It's 1.2 million in and just over 500,000 out. It's very concerning. It shows that we're not controlling our borders, and the things that really concern me in business is how is our infrastructure going to cope with this? The National Health Service, housing, education, schools, all of these things are going to be put under further massive pressure by this kind of influx, this kind of net increase of over 600,000 people.
All right, Angus, I'll come back to you in just a moment. Both you and Faye, of course, are at the sharp end to some extent on immigration, because you are both running businesses and hiring people. Faye, what's your reaction to the figure itself, 606,000?
I mean, my reaction is if we can, if we can put these people into employment and they're, and they can work and live in the UK, then personally, I think that it's good for our country. We have a huge shortage of workers in the hospitality industry, a massive staffing issue across the board in hospitality, and so. For me, I don't necessarily see it as a negative thing. You know, the more workers we have, the more we can work, the more, you know, the more everything works. But if people are here and they're not able to go into employment, then we have a problem.
Right. I mean, Angus, listening to what Faye has just said, is that your experience when you're hiring people? You welcome, because there are shortages, certainly in industries like Faye's.
Well, what concerns me is that we have a lot of, we have still high unemployment in this country. We have, I think, 9 million people economically inactive. I think
No, but that's not the same as unemployment. We've actually got quite high employment figures, but there are very high figures for long-term sick. There's no doubt about that, and also figures
that have unemployment. We still have unemployment.
Yes, yeah. But what's your experience of hiring people? What's your sort of policy broadly when you hire staff?
Well, generally, we don't have any problems recruiting people at the moment. We do have a local workforce, but that's also mixed with a number of people that have come over from Europe. We have Bulgarian, Polish, some Polish workers.
Yes.
But predominantly, we have a local workforce, and we recruit locally, and we don't seem to have too much of a problem finding people to come and work for our company.
OK, well, Faye, listening to what Angus has just said, he says he manages to recruit, in the main, locally, British workers. Could you do that?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to look at the social environment in which he's in. He's living in Hull. I work predominantly in central London. London is where we do, well, I would say 95% of our work. So we're in a very different social environment, you know, very, very different than somewhere like Hull. Very different in the cultural diversity as well. We have a huge cultural diversity, obviously, here in London, and that is definitely reflected in our workforce. So, for me personally, I have British people, British workers.
Yes.
Tend to be a lot lazier and unreliable than people coming in from other countries.
All right. Well, Angus, do you accept the differences, the regional differences? You're in Hull. Faye is in Hertfordshire. I mean, in the home counties, but obviously much closer to London.
I think Faye's making some gross generalisations there, and to say British workers are lazy, I think is pretty disgraceful. We've got a long-standing workforce.
Well, in our industry, which I work in, and I have 400 staff. I have 400 staff.
All right.
I have 400 staff, and I work in this industry, and I can tell you.
Hang on. If you talk over each other, hang on, Angus.
I think it's nice spot at the moment. Never mind.
Angus and Faye, if you talk over each other, it is very difficult for people to hear. So, Angus, final word from you, and then we'll leave it. But that's Faye's experience, Angus. That's her experience of hiring staff. What do you say?
Well, it's certainly not my experience. We have quite a mature workforce of people who've been working hard for us for a long time, and we do recruit locally. Now, there are a mixture of people that we recruit from, and we find that most of the people who come here are prepared to work. There are some young people who, find probably working in a factory quite hard work, and it's not for them. Well, that's fair enough. But one of the areas that perhaps I think is very important is education in schools, and we have a lot of people going to university, and we also have a lot of economically inactive people at the young and the old age.
All right.
What concerns me is that we're bringing more and more people into this country, putting massive strain on our infrastructure, when we've actually got, if we're prepared to put the work and the effort in, we've got a lot of people who could be trained and put to work in this country.
All right, well, that is a good point. That is a good point. That's a good point to leave it. But both of you, Faye Hall and Angus West, thank you both very much for joining us to talk about this issue of immigration, because it's a big political issue. Those are personal experiences of two people hiring staff and running businesses. But it's been a huge political issue because of the promises made by successive Conservative governments and Prime Ministers. Let's have a look.
Net migration to this country will be in the order of tens of thousands each year. No ifs, no buts.
It's important that we have net migration that is in sustainable numbers. We believe sustainable numbers are the tens of thousands.
We want a controlled system. That's the whole point.
I want to bring the levels of legal migration down.
Do you accept, Tom, this government's failed on immigration for 13 years?
I think net migration is at far too high a level. And I also think it's important when we talk about net migration, we don't just view it in terms of GDP. We view it in terms of GDP per capita, we view it in terms of pressure on public services, we view it in terms of housing, and also social and cultural consequences as well. And I think it's important we think about what the majority of British people want. And to be honest with you, I think you'd struggle to find much more than 10% of the population who would actually support net migration being at its current levels.
Right.
So I'm pleased the Prime Minister's committed to bringing it down.
But you admit it's been a failure for 13 years.
It's far higher than it ought to be. It's far higher than it ought to be.
Right. And what are you going to do about it, Tom?
Well, I mean, this week we've seen significant changes to student visas. We saw that, I think last year it was about 130,000 student dependents, for example. I think that the movements this week on that will make a big difference. And also it's important we take into account the number of Hong Kong and Ukrainian refugees that are part of that number as well.
Sure,
but even bearing all of that in mind, it is still too high.
Right, but you're one of the Conservative MPs who's been pushing hard for the government to go further on curtailing immigration in the way you have just outlined. What is it you want? What level do you want to see? What do you want the government to do?
I want us to have a bigger programme of investing in our own workforce. I want to have more apprenticeships. I want to have more skills. I want to have more of a focus in terms of, and I think there is a point. There's too many people who are economically inactive in our own country, but we can't continue to shut the British public out of this debate on net migration because it's happening at levels which is far too high for most of British people. And I think we should
you've written to Rishi Sunak. Have you had a response?
I haven't written to Rishi Sunak.
I thought the group of MPs had written to Rishi Sunak.
So I haven't written to Rishi Sunak about it. I have spoken to the Prime Minister about this and the Home Secretary, and I've made my views clear. But the Prime Minister himself has said it's too high and he wants to see the numbers come down. But I think it's also important we realise that a decision was made under a previous Labour government to dramatically increase the number of people who came here. But the previous...
that is a long time ago, and that was when we were part of the EU and there was free movement of people. And I'll come on to that in a moment with Sarah. Let's concentrate on now, on what you want to happen. You've spoken to Rishi Sunak, you've spoken to Suella Braverman. Do you think she is going to deliver for you?
I hope she does. We need to bring down net migration. I've been clear on what I want. I think net migration of 600,000 a year is far too much. I think it's far too much for most of the British people, and we need to bring it down significantly.
Will there be consequences if those numbers don't come down? We had the Conservative peer Stuart Jackson here last week saying it will be an exchange rate mechanism moment if this Conservative government has failed to bring down immigration.
A very large number of my constituents are hugely frustrated by both illegal migration and the small.
Well, let's talk on legal migration.
And also the levels of legal migration.
And so will there be consequences for the Tories?
If we don't get a grip of it, if we don't get a grip of it, I think there could be. Which is why we've got to use the time between now and the next general election to deliver on this, not just talk, but deliver.
All right, well, I will come to our other guests. But Sarah, Labour is pledged to bring down numbers. In fact, Emily Thornberry, your colleague, was sat here yesterday saying we'll do exactly that at the end of a first-term Labour government if you win the next election. How would you do it?
Well, I think Tom's answer shows that people...
Don't worry about Tom's answer. Let's concentrate on what Labour are going to do.
I think it is an important first point.
Well, I think we've made it clear.
Many promises made and none of them met. We've clearly lost control of the numbers and we clearly need to bring it down. Now, we have said several things. First, it is not fair that people can, that businesses can undercut wages by paying people less who come in on the shortage occupation list. So at the moment, if you're on the list of jobs that we need in this country at the moment, there's a shortage. Fishermen joining that list today.
Are you against extending the shortage occupation list? I mean, they've added bricklayers, roofers, tilers. Would you say no to those being added?
So the reason they've been added is because the Conservative government has failed to train our own people. So you have 7 million people on the NHS waiting list, many of whom won't be in a position to work. You have 2.5 million people on long-term sick who aren't in a position to work. We know there are problems structurally in the way that the job centres work, that they're not encouraging people back to work. They're not helping those over 50.
It's difficult to bring down the numbers, isn't it?
So we have set out a whole raft of policies that will train up British people to do the jobs that we need. Now, of course, we welcome and we need migration.
Right.
Nobody is going to argue with that. You just have to go to the NHS. But here's the important point. The nurses have been on that shortage list for the last 15 years, and the government has not made that connection between the jobs that are on that list and actually doing something about it.
All right,
that's why Labour would
briefly
recruit more nurses and doctors within the UK, paid for by the non-dom status.
They are quite long term. I'm not saying they are not credible
policies. You have to do those long term.
But let me just say, Faye was saying that she recruits a lot of her staff are foreign workers. She says British workers. She finds them lazier in that sense. She finds it easier to recruit foreign workers. You're going to make it more expensive for her to do so, aren't you?
It must be right that everyone's paid a decent wage and paid a fair wage. And there are things that we need to do to make sure everybody is paid a fair wage in this country as it stands. But it cannot be right that people can undercut a fair salary by bringing people in from another country and paying them less. That cannot be right on any level, and we will get rid of that, and that will reduce some of these numbers.
I don't want people to think that that's what Faye was doing. That is what that is.
That is allowed. You're allowed in the law to pay people.
And I don't know whether she was.
Less.
She may have been paying them the same, but you would be definitely making it more expensive.
And everybody agrees with that, by the way, apart from the government. I mean,
hang on, Tom.
Huge agreement.
I've got to come to our other guest. I mean, Jo, listening to this, would you say broadly there's any difference between the Conservatives and Labour in terms of their plans to deliver on pledge to reduce overall migration?
It's not easy, is it? I'm not a member of the Labour Party. I'm not a member of the Conservative Party. I don't find it terribly easy to determine what's different about their policies. I mean, I think the way in which the debate is framed is also really quite silly. Nobody actually cares about the total number of net immigrants. What people care about is whether they can find housing.
Tom said they do. Tom has said they do care.
Well, what people care about is whether they can find housing. Yeah. They care about whether they can get an NHS appointment. They care about whether they can get a school place. The government's own Construction Industry Training Board says that there's a massive shortfall, hundreds of thousands of people who do not exist, who we would need to build the houses to address the housing shortfall. When it comes to the NHS, the GMC, the BMA, the Medical Schools Council, the Royal Society of Medicine, all say we're not training enough doctors. When it comes to schools, we have a declining birth rate. So lots of schools in the part of the country where I live are closing because there are not enough kids. And that in turn throws up lots and lots of problems for the future because we're not going to have the economic activity necessary to sustain people in old age.
All right, let's talk about...
So in fact, immigration isn't the problem, it's the solution to the problem.
Do you agree with that? That actually it's the infrastructure. We heard it also from Angus West. It's the schools, it's the transport, it's the hospitals. With the right infrastructure, then people wouldn't mind about the overall levels of migration.
I think that's definitely half of the picture. And you just look at, for example, the NHS, we have far fewer GPs per head, fewer hospital beds per head than most of Western Europe. So, I mean, it's undeniable that there is competition for public services in areas with increasing populations. So obviously that would go away to some extent if there was better infrastructure, if there was enough housing, transport, schools, health service and so on. But I think the other side of it is the employment side. And the fact that this keeps coming up, that nurses have been on the, there's a shortage, we have to import them list for years and years and years, that care workers are still largely coming in from countries where the kind of minimum wage we pay here is a decent wage, whereas here it's really, we were talking about the energy prices going up, transport prices going up. It's really hard to live on minimum wage here, and yet, I mean, when was the Brexit vote? 2016?
But we didn't.
There's been plenty of time to start training people. We had the lorry drivers, HGV drivers. Suddenly it's like, oh no, we're going to have to train UK HGV drivers. Well, I'm sorry, you've had plenty of warning to get this done.
Well, I mean, there is that issue. And what about Jo's point that actually people don't really care about the overall level of immigration?
I don't think that's correct. I think polling is pretty clear. The vast majority of British public
even if they addressed the other issue,
reduced, and clearly having net migration at 600,000 will have an influence on housing. It will have an influence on. I don't think anyone's saying we shouldn't be open to some skills needs being covered by some immigration at sustainable levels. I don't think anybody's saying that. But can I just touch upon one point? Because I do think it's important. I think net migration is too high. I think the government needs to do more. I've been clear about that. But I also think it's clear that we need to look at the Labour Party's credibility on this. Because you're hearing things from the Labour Party today after we've had the leader not long ago standing on a platform of bringing back free movement. Mm-hmm. He's voted against all attempts to control illegal migration, opposed to a Rwanda scheme. Desperate. And also, I know you can say, well, it's not desperate, it's true. And I think it's also important that you look, I know you can say, oh, it's 13 years ago, but the last time we had a Labour Prime Minister, he dismissed
lower than it is now.
So the last Labour Prime Minister dismissed members of the public who had legitimate concerns about high levels of migration as bigots. That is the last time we had a Labour Prime Minister, and we now have a Labour leader who changes his view every day on this issue.
Hundreds of thousands,
Sarah. Those are the facts.
Hundreds of thousands.
It's not desperate, those are the facts.
Right, I mean, Sarah, in 2020, Keir Starmer said that if he became Prime Minister, 2020, he'd bring back free movement of people with the EU. He has changed his mind on that.
Yep.
But there will be doubt in people's minds, people like Tom, that he's really serious about reducing immigration. He says he wants to do it, but will he? Does he?
Well, I mean, the Ipsos Mori poll came out today showing that the public now trust the Labour Party more on immigration than they do the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party lost 10,000 seats in the council elections a couple of weeks ago. So I think the public are seeing that the Tories might be good at a 1,000. Forgive me, only 1,000. The Tories might be good at a slogan, but they are rubbish at running the country. And it applies across the board, whether it's the record numbers of the backlog on the asylum, which has come out today, whether it's uncontrolled policies when it comes to migration because the economy is failing, whether it's the scale of the debt, whether it's the strikes, whether it's the backlogs. Everything is worse than it was in 2010.
So I've said, net migration is too high in my view. I've also said I'm very frustrated by illegal migration.
Maybe but
I'm also clearly of the view, I've got no doubt whatsoever that if we had a Labour government right now, that level would be far higher. There'd be no plan for illegal migration because they voted against every plan there is.
Right. Well,
and I think that's abundantly clear to me. And I think when it comes to a general election, I think it'll be abundantly clear to the British public.
Well, we'll see, of course, when that general election is called. We have to move on, but I just want to ask you one question, Timandra. There is one thing about taking back control with the Brexit vote. That was the broad slogan. And actually, arguably, the government has taken back control when it comes to immigration because they've accepted visas for people from Ukraine, from Hong Kong. They've issued, about 250,000 work visas, and the rest are students, broadly, and dependents. Well, they've chosen to do that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Is that what
I was thinking that was like, have we lost control? Well, I mean, there's the small boats issue, which is a separate
issue. But that's the illegals.
But the record figures are largely people from the Ukraine who are massively welcomed by the British public, people from Hong Kong fleeing our authoritarian government, also massively welcomed. Students, I think most people are really not bothered about students, come, stay 3 or 4 years, go away again. And I mean, I can't speak for all Leave voters, obviously, but for me personally, the idea that we have far more people able to come here on a fairer basis from non-European countries, rather than being discriminated against because they were not from Europe, I think is an improvement. That's what I wanted.
Very briefly,
a fairer immigration system.
Well, just briefly.
Well, the thing is, we've always had control of non-EU migration. We've always had, even when we were in the EU, we had control of migration from outside the EU. And that's the number that has really exploded. If you look at the data, if you disaggregate the ONS data today, what you see is that people
really hard for them to come here before.
What you see is that people from the UK people are net emigrants. They're leaving the 4,000 net emigration this year, and EU nationals are also leaving, but they're being dwarfed by a part of immigration policy of which the British government has always had control.
We haven't got...
EU thing is just
I know we could do the whole programme on it, and we almost have. So we're going to move on. Let's just have a look at this Evening Standard headline. Sunak and AI leaders discuss existential threats and disinformation fears. The Prime Minister sat down, and we'll show you the pictures in a minute, with the chief executives of ChatGPT firm OpenAI, Google DeepMind and Anthropic. Now, it's been reported that Rishi Sunak has adopted a more cautious tone. The government had in the past said it was very much open for business, wanted to be at the forefront, and Michelle Donnellan, then Technology Secretary, said we have nothing to fear from AI. Do you think, Timandra, AI is an existential threat to humanity?
I don't. I'm always a little baffled by the way it's treated as so very different from other kinds of technology, which have had a massive impact and will have a massive impact on society. I think it's...
But these guys are saying it is, and they should know. They're running these.
Yeah. Well, they would think that, wouldn't they? I mean, honestly, if you went back to the 19th century and spoke to people who were in energy revolutions, like oil and electricity and so on, I'm sure they would have said this is going to change the world, and arguably they have changed the world. Was it an existential threat to humanity? No. Was it a massive change that was not a good change for everybody? Well, yeah, obviously these technological revolutions do change society. But I am a bit baffled by the way AI is treated as a thing that's so separate from data-driven technologies generally.
All right, so you're baffled. I mean, I suppose people would argue that it's happening at a much, much quicker pace, and even these people who should know don't know how it could develop. Are you fearful of it? Do you think there should be more regulation?
I think we need to be very, very cautious. I listen to people who know much more about the subject than I do, like Tamandra. But for every Tamandra, there are also people who are extremely expert and extremely concerned about what AI means. And this is not like, test driving a new car, right? You can't give it a go, and if you don't like it, drop it back at the lot. This AI genie, if it gets out of the bottle, there's no way of stuffing it back in. We don't really know what it means, and so that really ought to cause us to be very, very cautious. Not to stop it, of course we can't stop it, but to move slowly and cautiously.
Is that the right position for the government? Slowly and cautiously, not steaming ahead in the way the Technology Secretary had said in the past, or not?
Well, I just watched a film called Megan, actually, which was about a child's doll who ended up going on a massive killing spree. So I'm not going to allow that. I'm not going to allow that to influence.
It's daytime.
But I think it is, it is of significant value to British. The economic potential is clear. I think it's worth about £3.6 billion already to the British economy. But yeah, of course, we want to tread cautiously. Like we would do with anything of that magnitude. But also, I think we've got to be clear-eyed to some potential significant economic benefits as well. I think we've, so far, got a balance about right.
You do think that? I mean, she said it's not something we should fear. People should trust that computers which think and learn won't be used to undermine their safety, their privacy, their rights or their health. Do you agree with Michelle Donnellan on that?
I think she's got the balance about right in those comments, and I think that there's a white paper published at the back end of March. I can't confess myself to be an expert on this, but I can see that it's of significant. It's a significant issue, and I can see the potential if we don't get it right, potential risks, but I also see some potential gains as well.
Well, OK. I mean, you are talking about the balance. Let's just show you this headline, BBC News, about jobs, because BT to cut 55,000 jobs with up to a fifth replaced by AI. I mean, people will be worried about that kind of thing, won't they?
Of course, you see that headline, you would be concerned. I mean, I think some of the people that the Prime Minister met with yesterday are concerned about the real high risk of AI being used by hostile state actors to introduce cyber attacks and biohazards, and there is a whole world of potential horror there. And I think the issue is, how do we grasp the potential but regulate it properly? So the Prime Minister has said thus far in the White Paper and others that we don't need regulation. Absolutely, we do. Darren Jones, the chair of the Select Committee, wrote to the Prime Minister yesterday and said, why don't you invite all of the G7 to England and let's have to Britain and let's have a conversation and a plan for what we are going to do about those very high risks.
And would you be in favour of an international regulator and the UK being at the forefront of that?
We certainly need to be looking at regulation, because this is something that is developing ahead of our legal and regulatory structures. And with all industry, with all technology, with all processes, we need a proper regulation to make sure those risks are mitigated. And I don't think we're anywhere near that at the moment.
All right, let's move on. This headline in The Times: Whitehall clash over Boris Johnson's COVID diary. It refers to the story that the judge in charge of the COVID inquiry has threatened the Cabinet Office with legal action unless it hands over unredacted notes and WhatsApp messages and diaries belonging to the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson for it to peruse and interrogate. Jo, should the Cabinet Office hand over all the diaries and WhatsApp messages from the former Prime Minister?
A really interesting undercurrent to this story is that you have a retired Court of Appeal judge, Heather Hallett, saying that she doesn't really trust the Cabinet Office to hand over messages. And the reason why that's really, really interesting to me is because the whole of the British Constitution is built on what seemed to me rather unsteady sands, seemed to have the Hallett to be unsteady sands as well, that everyone can be trusted to do the right thing because this is England, a country where bad things never happen. And for me, at a sort of deep cultural level, that's what she's calling into question. So the way in which judicial review works, for example, is that government is asked to hand over everything that's relevant, and if you think that it hasn't, you've got very little opportunity to second guess what government's handed over, and Heather Hallett is calling that into question. I think she's right. We do need to modernise our constitution.
OK, well, Tom, do you think it's right that WhatsApp messages, which is how some government was done, I suppose, during the COVID inquiry, should be handed over?
I'm usually not, backwards and coming forwards with my opinions on things. I have to say, I haven't given this a huge amount of thought. Over the last 24 hours, I've been very focused on some other issues. And I have to say, this just constant soap opera about Boris Johnson and the various different privileges committee and everything else, I really think is becoming ever so slightly tiresome. But, ultimately, if you're in government and you're close to decision making, sometimes you will have to communicate various messages. Sometimes there might be some sensitivity and some security implications to that. So I think there may be occasions where it's not appropriate to share certain messages. Maybe there's other occasions where it can. It is important the COVID inquiry does its job properly and looks into everything. So, but I have to say I'm sort of slightly sitting on the fence on this one. But I really, with some of the issues going on at the moment about the cost of living, the immigration debate, the energy prices, I have to say I've probably been spending more time thinking about those issues than ongoing issues with Boris Johnson to do with various different inquiries and a privilege committee. But this is an important point there about messages and if there's certain messages where it wouldn't be appropriate to share and other occasions where it might be able to share. So
it's not really that important, as
it's,
Tom said.
It's incredibly important. What we saw during the pandemic is that tens and tens of billions of pounds were spent often on the back of WhatsApp exchanges between ministers and their special advisors. We know how catastrophically wrong COVID procurement went. We know that as much money as was spent, about 12.5 billion quid on PPE was wasted, and much of it went to VIP Conservative Party but actually, friends of the Conservative Party.
Just to interrupt, but you brought a case, I think it was in January 22, a judgment on the Good Law Project's judicial review challenges to the government's award of contracts for PPE, and all 9 of the contracts had been awarded without competition. But in the end, the High Court ruled almost entirely in the government's favour.
No, that's just not true. The High Court ruled that the contract awards were illegal. And we asked government in another piece of litigation to hand over Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages.
And what did they say?
And Cabinet Office told us they didn't exist.
All right. Well, look,
and there's a real tension between that and what Cabinet Office is now saying.
I don't know the detail
I do
specifically.
know.
Yeah, but what we come back to is this issue that should all WhatsApp messages, private WhatsApp messages to some extent, arguably, be handed over in these inquiries?
I think that's a very dangerous precedent. I mean, obviously, I don't think government should be done by WhatsApp messages. I think that's a very, very bad precedent. And some of the ones that have emerged have revealed that it's not necessarily the kind of government that any of us would want. But I do think it's a very dangerous precedent to say that conversations that you thought were private and that are end-to-end encrypted are in fact fair game. I mean, it's by no means the first time it's happened. It happens a lot, and also we're periodically reminded that a group chat is only as private as everybody in the group. Which is a good reminder for everybody. But I do think, we've got the online safety bill going through Parliament, which is all about, what can be regulated and what's fair game and what may be said online. And I think if you're starting to say, you had this conversation, you thought it was private, that's why you put it on WhatsApp, but now, we're going to come in and get it and pull it apart as if it was a public conversation. I think it's a dangerous precedent.
Is it going to have a chilling effect?
Privacy
but WhatsApp, government has been done by WhatsApp because it had to be to some extent during
the notion
times like
that
COVID.
Heather Hallett is unable to distinguish between WhatsApps that are about government business and WhatsApps that are purely private matters just bears no examination.
Does it help get to the truth, though?
Important.
Does it help get to the truth? If you are looking at messages and communications that are done, they're not considered particularly in WhatsApp, do you think it helps get to the truth?
It absolutely does. And we know this because special advisors are increasingly using these channels because they are not subject to scrutiny. That is actually where the business is being done.
I think that, you know, I'm not saying that, like, under no circumstances should WhatsApp messages ever be shared with some, but I think that there certainly may well be occasions where it would be inappropriate depending on the specific messages in question. So, but I do think, I mean, clearly, you know, there were mistakes made, you know, during the pandemic. But I do think when we look back on it with the benefit of hindsight, we rake over everything. I do think it's important.
Well, Sarah, if there's a Labour government comes in next year, will you, as a minister, let's say, in that government, be happy for all WhatsApp communications to be handed over at any given time?
Well, I think, firstly, I agree with Tom's first point that the former Prime Minister has become very tiresome. We keep having these stories.
And the answer to my question?
The key point as well for the inquiry, because nobody's made this point yet, and it's really important, this is the inquiry into what happened when, you know, thousands of people lost their lives. If the inquiry are asking for that information, we should give them that information. And if the government doesn't want to, why not? What have they got to hide? And I think the point about, you know, should we do government by WhatsApp is a very accurate one. Now, there are lots of things to be done in this space, not least one of the things that we would want to see in government is to introduce an ethics commission, so you have an independent body that can set up an inquiry and not have to wait for the Prime Minister, for example, as we currently have, to give permission and to decide he wants an inquiry before one happens. There are structures we can put in place to bring better government back.
And would you be prepared to hand over all your WhatsApp messages?
Well, I am always quite careful of what I put in my WhatsApp. People are now deleting them, aren't they? They have these things where they disappear after, WhatsApp. You know, so these things are tricky. But the point is, if the inquiries ask for them, I think you should hand them over, and if not, why not is the question.
I think unless there's a really good reason relating to a specific series of WhatsApp chats where it's not appropriate, I think, yes, I mean, I think if you're conducting work on WhatsApp, if you're conducting work via email, I mean, ultimately it's, in that sense, it's the same.
Right.
So unless there's I can see there being certain circumstances where there might be a good reason why a particular message it would be inappropriate for security. I don't know what that reason off the top of my head might be, but it's possible there might be.
So do you think all phone calls should be recorded and kept in case anyone wants to listen back to what phone conversations?
That's exactly what happened. Once upon a time, ministers would not conduct government business without a civil servant being present. Yes.
Do you think every single conversation in a corridor in the Palace of Westminster should be recorded and put on the record?
Every single conversation involving government business should have a civil servant there so that we can all have confidence in politics.
So if you went to go in and talk to your MP and say, look, I just want to raise this thing I'm very worried about, I think you might be able to speak up about, can we have a little chat just to see if there's anything we can do?
That's private and confidential. That would be separate.
OK, so that's private and confidential. So are politicians not allowed to have any private conversations, is what I'm asking?
Of course they are.
But how would they have them?
The fact that a civil servant is recording a conversation on a subject of government business does not have as its consequence that conversation is published. It just has as its consequence...
Well, it does.
Just let me finish, Tom. Just let me finish. It has as its consequence that when it comes to unpacking the truth of what happened, whether it be COVID procurement or whether it be how we got so badly wrong the handling of the initial stages of the pandemic, there is a good public record. That's really important.
All right.
So
well, since you've mentioned that on the truth, because
future.
we should mention your book. I know it's near the end of the programme, Bringing Down Goliath. I'll come to you, Tom. This is about campaigning and seeking change through the law. You've made numerous legal challenges, we mentioned one earlier, to government and corporations. Is that the right approach to bring change and better government?
I think if you look at trust in politics at the moment, it's really, really low. It's in the teens.
But would that go for better government? Would that make better government?
The law is part of how you deliver better government. It's certainly not the whole. What the central thesis of the book is this, that the law presently is a tool that only very rich people get to use. There's no longer any legal aid. And that has as its consequence that it cements the position that rich people have.
All right.
And what Good Law Project does and what the book explains is that the law can also be used as a tool by normal people to advance the things that they can care about.
Tom, finally?
I think it does cause... It can cause the public great frustration, though, when they do see lawyers acting in a way which is going against where the majority view is. And I do think there are occasions where actually if you disagree with something, make arguments against that thing, don't just try and legally frustrate it. And I think we're seeing that to a certain extent with the government's approach to illegal migration, where instead of actually making the case and trying to win over the public...
Policy just won't work.
That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Layla Natha will be back tomorrow with Politics UK. From all of us here, bye-bye.